In 1893, the price of silver fell by roughly a third in a single month. In Colorado, that month ended an era. Leadville went quiet. Aspen went quiet. The mines closed, the banks closed, and the single industry towns that had made the Rocky Mountain West the richest ground on the continent began the long process of becoming something smaller than they had been. Tourist stops, ghost towns, casinos on the sites of former fortunes. The Panic of 1893 killed them the way a flood kills a valley, completely and without warning. Denver survived, not because it was lucky, because it was not a mining town. It had 106,713 people in 1890. It would have 133,859 by 1900. While every mountain rival was declining, the one city in Colorado that had never dug a single ounce of its own gold kept growing. Today, Denver is a city of more than 715,000, the capital of the state, the center of a metropolitan region near 3 million. And the dome of its state capital is covered in 200 ounces of pure gold leaf. The gold was donated by the Cripple Creek Mine, the same district that went quiet a decade after the donation. This is the story of how the town without gold outlasted every town that had it. Chapter 1. The Town with No Gold. The land where Denver now stands was not chosen. It was arrived at. For the length of the Rocky Mountains, running 700 miles through the spine of the continent, there is one place where the high plains meet the peaks at something approaching a reasonable grade, where the ground levels briefly, where two small rivers converge, and where a traveler moving west from the Mississippi has one last chance to organize himself before the serious climbing begins. That place sits at an elevation of 5,280 feet above sea level, precisely 1 mile above the ocean, at the junction of Cherry Creek and the South Platte River. Nothing in the ground beneath it was ever worth digging for. The gold was always in the mountains. The gold would always be somewhere else. This mattered less than it should have in the beginning, because in 1858 nobody had found the gold yet. The Rocky Mountain West was still, in the imagination of most Americans, a landscape to be crossed rather than claimed. A long, inhospitable passage between the Missouri River and the Pacific coast, useful mainly as a problem to be solved. The plains stretched west from the Mississippi in a brown monotony that pioneers had taken to calling the Great American Desert, and the mountains beyond them rose with the particular indifference of terrain that does not care whether anyone passes through. The junction of Cherry Creek and the South Platte was not a destination. It was a waypoint. Men stopped there to water their animals, to rest, and to continue. What the geography offered, quietly and without announcement, was a structural fact. Everything moving between the eastern plains and the mountains had to pass through this place. Men, supplies, animals, and later money. Anything traveling the corridor between the frontier settlements of Kansas Territory and the high country to the west would funnel through the confluence of those two rivers as a matter of simple topography. To the north, the rivers diverged into marshland. To the south, the land rose steeply into broken country. The junction was the door. In 1858, it had no name and no permanent population and no particular reason for anyone to linger. It was a door with no house attached to it yet. The settlement that formed there in the late summer and autumn of 1858 was raw, in the way that accidental places are raw. It had no charter, no elected government, no streets in any formal sense. What it had was a collection of men who had arrived from the East with tools and ambitions, and a rumor about gold, somewhere to the west, somewhere in the mountains, in quantities that had not yet been verified, but that grew considerably in the retelling. By the time the story reached Illinois and Ohio and Georgia, a few $100s in placer dust, pulled from a gravel bar 30 miles south of the junction, had become the opening chapter of a new California. Men packed wagons and headed west on that rumor through the autumn of 1858, and the junction of Cherry Creek and the South Platte was the last flat ground they crossed before the peaks began in earnest. The settlement took shape on both banks of Cherry Creek. On the west bank, a party of Georgians staked a town site they called Auraria. On the east bank, a land speculator from Leavenworth, Kansas named William Larimer, arriving in November 1858, jumped an abandoned claim and platted a rival town in a single night. He was not a man who hesitated in the presence of opportunity. He named his town site Denver City, after James Denver, the governor of Kansas Territory, hoping the flattery would produce a favorable land patent. He had not yet learned that Governor Denver had already resigned. The name stayed anyway. Neither Auraria nor Denver City had any gold. They sat where they sat not because the ground beneath them was rich, but because the mountains ahead of them were rumored to be. Between those two small, muddy, competing camps in the peaks 30 miles west, an entire economy was already forming without a mine in sight. Merchants were selling shovels and flour and rope and whiskey to men who were passing through. Blacksmiths were shoeing horses. Boarding house keepers were charging rates that would have seemed absurd in Cincinnati. The town had arrived at its permanent occupation before it had a name, before it had streets, before it had any legal standing at all. The occupation of a place that exists to equip other places, to provision the work that happens somewhere else, to profit from the fact that everything must pass through here. In those first months, winter tightening over the high plains, the men who had come to Cherry Creek were waiting. Not for gold, not here, not in this ground, for the news, which would come in the spring, of what the mountains contained. The peaks were there, close enough on a clear day to seem reachable in an afternoon, though the distance was deceptive and the terrain was not. Whatever was inside them was still inside them. The junction was the door, and the door was still closed. Chapter 2. The Rumor. William Green Russell was a Georgia-born prospector who had already crossed the continent once before. He had worked the California diggings in the early 1850s, developed the prospector's particular patience for failure, and come home to Lickskillet, Georgia, with enough knowledge of placer geology to believe by 1857 that the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains held something worth the journey. He was not alone in that belief. Among the men he organized for the expedition west were members of the Cherokee Nation, people who had mined placer gold in the Georgia hills before federal removal had stripped them of that ground in the late 1830s. They knew what color gold made in a pan. They had been made to leave the first place they'd found it. Russell's party reached the South Platte country in the early summer of 1858 and spent weeks finding almost nothing. The creeks ran cold and clear and largely empty. The mountains stood at the western horizon with no indication of what they contained. Then, in July 1858, at the confluence of Dry Creek and the South Platte, in country that would become the town of Englewood, a few miles south of the Cherry Creek Junction, the pans finally showed color. The yield, by the most careful accounting, amounted to a few $100s in dust. Not nothing. Not enough to retire on. Not enough, by any honest measure, to send for your family. What left Dry Creek that summer was not the gold. It was the story of the gold, passed eastward from mouth to mouth, reprinted in newspapers from Missouri to Massachusetts, growing in the telling the way stories do when they travel without anyone responsible for the facts. A few $100s in dust became a field of extraordinary richness. A modest find in a remote creek became confirmation that the Rockies were another California. By the time the word had moved far enough east, William Green Russell had found something the rumor no longer resembled. The cry that rose in the autumn and winter of 1858 and through the following spring was not precise about the geography. Pikes Peak was the landmark everyone knew, the great granite mass visible from the plains for 50 miles. And so Pikes Peak became the destination even though the actual diggings were nowhere near its slopes. Pikes Peak or bust. The slogan traveled on wagon covers, on newspaper mastheads, on the lips of men who had sold their farms, or left their shops, or borrowed against everything they owned, because the arithmetic of a gold strike, if you could believe the figures, was the arithmetic of a man's entire life, changed in a single season. An estimated 100,000 people set out across the Kansas and Nebraska plains in the spring of 1859. They walked, and they rode, and they drove oxen, and they carried the rumor with them like a lantern, perhaps half turned back. They were called the Go-Backers, and they returned eastward through the same wagon trails they had come west on, their livestock thin and their equipment worn, and their confidence in the original reports cured into something closer to contempt. The Pikes Peak hoax, the newspapers called it. The men who reversed course told the men they passed still heading west that there was nothing out there, that the whole thing had been invented by merchants and land speculators to put traffic on the roads, that the mountains were empty and the promise was a lie. Some of those eastbound men were right. Some were simply wrong about what the mountains contained because they had not gone far enough in to find out. The men who completed the journey and reached the Cherry Creek Junction did not find a gold field. They found a depot, a scatter of tents and raw timber buildings on two banks of a shallow creek stocked with flour, whiskey, hardware, and other men's hope. They arrived hungry from weeks across the plains. They arrived in debt from the cost of the journey. They arrived to find that the easy gold, if there had ever been easy gold, was already gone. What remained was the question the rumor had raised but could not answer: whether anything real was sitting in the mountains to the west, waiting in the lodes rather than the creeks, requiring not a pan, but a hammer and a knowledge of rock. The rumor needed proof, and proof was about to arrive from a gulch 30 miles up into the peaks, from a place where the geology was different, where the gold was not loose in the gravel but locked in quartz, where the math of the strike would be large enough to silence every go-backer who had turned around on the plains. Chapter 3. The Richest Square Mile. The man who ended the hoax had no particular reason to be in Colorado. John Gregory was a Georgia-born prospector, drifting and methodical, who had worked the California fields in the early 1850s and understood, from that experience, the difference between placer gold, dust shaken loose by water into gravel, and the thing that placer gold was always pointing toward: a lode, a seam of gold-bearing quartz locked in the rock of a mountain, the source from which every fleck of loose color in every stream bed had originally broken free. On May 6, 1859, working a narrow tributary drainage between what would become Black Hawk and Central City, Gregory found one. Not color, in a pan, a vein. The lode ran through quartz in a gulch that would take his name, and the numbers it produced were not the numbers of Dry Creek. Within weeks of the Gregory strike, experienced miners who came up to assess it were reporting yields that made the Pikes Peak hoax look like the plainest possible truth. The word moved downhill into the camp at Cherry Creek, and then east across the telegraph wires with a speed that only the promise of serious money can generate. By the time summer settled over the Front Range, between 20,000 and 30,000 people had poured into the mountains above Denver. They came on foot and by mule, and on the backs of wagons that could barely negotiate the switchback trails carved into the canyon walls. Gregory Gulch, a crease in the mountain terrain barely wide enough for two men to pass, was suddenly the most crowded street in the Rocky Mountain West. The area came to be called the richest square mile on earth. That phrase was not invented by a promoter or a newspaperman trying to sell claims. It arrived as description, the simplest available accounting for what the ground was producing. Here was the proof that the go-backers had denied: that the gold was real, that the mountains held it, that the men who had turned around on the plains had done so too soon. What the Gulch needed in those first frantic months of 1859 was a witness with a name the country would believe. It got one. Horace Greeley was the most widely read newspaper editor in the United States, the founder and longtime editor of the New York Tribune, a man whose opinions on politics and westward expansion had been shaping public discourse for 2 decades. He traveled to Colorado in the summer of 1859, not as a speculator and not as a promoter, but as a journalist, in the oldest sense of the word, to see the thing himself and report what he found. He went up into the diggings. He watched men work the lode. He had orasayed. He published what he observed with the measured authority of someone who understood that his credibility was the instrument he was deploying, and that if he was wrong, he would not recover from it. He was not wrong. His dispatches in the Tribune converted rumor into documented fact in a single news cycle. The go-backers had no credible answer for Greeley. The hoax was finished. Back at Cherry Creek, the 2 rival camps had watched the mountain strike with the particular anxiety of men who had built their futures on a wager that was now being settled somewhere else. Auraria on the west bank, founded by the Georgia Party. Denver City on the east, staked overnight by Larimer and named for a governor who had already left office. 2 muddy, argumentative collections of tents and timber frames, each convinced the other would fail first. What the Gregory strike did to both of them was empty them, drain them of every man willing and able to swing a pick into mountain rock. The gold was up in the gulches, not here. The merchants stayed. The speculators stayed. The men who intended to dig left. And in April 1860, with no particular ceremony, and with most of the argument already settled by irrelevance, Auraria and Denver City merged into a single Denver. Larimer had bet, from his first night on the east bank of Cherry Creek, that the money was in the men and not in the ground, that the place where men arrived, equipped, and departed was worth more, in the long accounting, than the place where they swung picks until the vein ran out. The merger proved him a town builder rather than a fool. Denver was now a city, in name, if not yet in mass. It had one name, one administration, one side of the creek. What it did not have was the gold. The gold was 30 miles west, locked in quartz at altitude, in a gulch that 30,000 men were already working. Denver was something else. Denver was the place they passed through on the way. That is what it would remain. The door between the plains and the peaks, the last town before the mountains got serious. What that meant in the years ahead was not yet visible in the spring of 1860, not fully. But the men who stayed behind, who kept the flour and the hardware and the whiskey moving, were already building the thing that would outlast every pick and every seam. Chapter 4. The Supply Town. The men who went into the mountains in the summer of 1859 did not go to Denver. That was, in the end, the whole point. Cherry Creek's thin placers had already given up what they had. A few $100s in dust, enough to start the rumor and not enough to sustain it. And when John Gregory's load blew the mountain open in May of that year, the population of the tent city at the confluence packed its gear and followed the ore uphill, leaving behind the merchants, the freighters, the men who had sunk their money not into picks and sluice boxes, but into flour, hardware, and whiskey. A traveler passing through in 1859 wrote that Denver was an unimportant place, a sort of fitting-out station for Pike's Peak. He meant it as a slight. He had no way of knowing he was describing the mechanism by which the town would survive everything that came next. The logic of the provisioning town is not romantic, but it is durable. A miner who strikes gold still needs to eat. He needs rope and blasting powder and boots that hold together in creek water. He needs a place to spend the money when the vein runs out, and he comes back down the mountain with nothing but the experience of having had it. The merchants who sold him those things made smaller margins than the man who hit a rich pocket, and they made them every week, regardless of whether the gold held. Mining the miners, some called it, a phrase that carried contempt in the gulches and functioned as sound economics in the storefronts along Blake Street and Larimer. The men who kept the flour and the hardware and the whiskey moving were building something the mountain camps were not: a diversified revenue base, a settled population, a town with reasons to exist that did not depend on the ground staying rich. Then the disasters came. They came one after another, within 13 months of each other, with the regularity of a place being tested to find out what it was made of. On April 19, 1863, fire broke out in a downtown saloon and moved through the young commercial district with the speed that wood frame construction in a dry spring allows. More than 70 buildings were destroyed before the fire burned itself out. The losses ran between $200,000 and $350,000. In a town 12 years old, in a territory that was not yet a state, those numbers represented not an inconvenience, but an existential wound. The city council met in the aftermath and passed a brick ordinance requiring all new construction in the commercial district to be fireproof. It was a decision made by men who had watched their investment burn and had concluded, without sentiment, that it would not burn the same way twice. The rebuilding began before the ash was cold. By Christmas of 1863, the burnt district was nearly whole, not in wood this time, but in brick and stone, heavier and more permanent than what the fire had taken. Denver upgraded itself by burning down. The second blow arrived in May of 1864, barely a year later. Cherry Creek, the thin trickle that had started everything, had always flooded in spring. It rose in wet years and cut its banks and caused a nuisance and receded, and the town had absorbed it the way a young settlement absorbs minor inconvenience, and forgot about it. But on the night of May 19th, the creek did not flood. It erased. A wall of water came through the town in the dark, killing at least 8 people, washing the city records into the South Platte, taking structures and livestock, and the accumulated paperwork of a municipal government with the indifference of moving water for everything humans have written down. The people rebuilt a second time, with the same flat efficiency they had brought to the fire, as if rebuilding were simply the next item of business, which it was. What the fire and the flood revealed, separately and together, was a characteristic of the place that would define it across every crisis that followed. A depot town's value is its staying power. The miners could afford to leave. They were always leaving, chasing the next strike, pulling up stakes when the vein thinned. The merchants could not afford to leave, or rather, they had concluded that leaving was the more expensive option, and so they stayed and rebuilt in brick, and rebuilt again after the water, and were there when the miners came back down the mountain needing flour and rope and whiskey. That was not courage in any elevated sense. It was the working logic of people who had too much invested to walk away. Denver had survived fire. It had survived flood. It would rebuild from both, sturdier each time, with ordinances and stone and the kind of institutional memory that only forms in a place that intends to remain. But the water and the flame had been local problems, containable problems, problems that a determined town council and a willing labor force could address with brick and cleared channels and the simple passage of time. What was coming next would not arrive as weather or combustion. It would arrive as a decision made by men in a boardroom who had never set foot in Colorado and did not particularly care whether Denver existed or not. Or, Chapter 5, The Only Door. The trouble with being bypassed by a railroad was that it looked at first like a business decision made somewhere far away by people who had never visited and would not be visiting. That was all it was officially. A routing choice, a matter of grades and surveying and the cold arithmetic of construction costs. The Union Pacific, laying the first transcontinental line across the American continent in the mid-1860s, had looked at the mountains west of Denver and concluded that the grades were too steep, the engineering too expensive, the detour not worth it. The line would go north through Cheyenne, Wyoming, across flatter ground at lower cost. Denver was not consulted. Denver was simply not on the map the engineers had drawn. What that meant, in the railroad age, was not an inconvenience. It was a sentence. A town the trains skipped was a town the merchants skipped, and a town the merchants skipped was a town the settlers skipped, and a town the settlers skipped became, with the particular swiftness of the frontier, a town that had been. The population that had rebuilt twice in 2 years, once from fire, once from flood, began to leave. Businesses that had survived the Great Fire of 1863 and the Cherry Creek Flood of 1864 could not survive the slower erosion of freight routed around them. Cheyenne, already a Union Pacific division point, was growing where Denver was contracting. Newspapers in the East wrote about Cheyenne as the future capital of the Mountain West. They were not being polemical. They were reading the logistics correctly. It was structural, this threat, not physical. Fire burns and floods recede, and a city that endures them can point to what it rebuilt and call the evidence visible. But there is no charred timber to show when the trains simply go north. There is only the quiet absence of freight, the warehouse that does not fill, the stage line that reroutes, the bank that recalculates. By 1866, Denver was a city calculating what it might be willing to lose and discovering that the answer was most of it. Enter John Evans and William Byers. Evans was a physician-turned-politician, appointed governor of Colorado Territory by Abraham Lincoln in 1862, a man who had already helped found Northwestern University before he arrived on the frontier, and who had come west with a systematic understanding of how railroads created cities. Byers was the founder and editor of the Rocky Mountain News, Denver's first and most consequential newspaper, a man who had been printing broadsides about Denver's future since 1859, when the ink was barely dry on the city's claim stakes. Different men, different methods. The same conclusion. If the Union Pacific would not come to Denver, Denver would go to the Union Pacific. In 1867, Evans and Byers organized the Denver Pacific Railway Company. The model was straightforward and the financing was not. They would build 106 miles of track north from Denver to Cheyenne, connecting the city to the transcontinental main line under its own power and at its own expense. There was no federal cash subsidy. Congress had provided a land grant. Sections of public land the company could sell to raise capital, but no direct appropriation, no government check. What funded the Denver Pacific was the city itself, its merchants and bankers, and remaining property owners, the people who understood that without this railroad, there was no Denver worth having. They raised the money in a town that was losing population. It was the investment of people who had decided collectively that leaving was not the answer. The work took 3 years. What came in on June 24, 1870, was not merely a locomotive. It was the resolution of a question the entire preceding decade had been asking. Whether a fitting out station, a place that had survived by selling shovels to other men's dreams, could survive the withdrawal of those dreams when the dreams moved on. The first Denver Pacific train answered it. The Kansas Pacific arrived weeks later in August of 1870 from the east, giving Denver a second connection to the national network, a redundancy the city had not possessed a year before and would not relinquish again. Cheyenne did not inherit the region. Denver took it. The stubbornness that had rebuilt the burnt district in brick was the same stubbornness that built 106 miles of railroad out of a nearly empty treasury. Not the stubbornness of abundance, not the stubbornness of men with capital to spare. The stubbornness of men who had calculated the alternative and found it unacceptable. Denver had survived fire, and it had survived flood, and it had survived the bypass by refusing to be bypassed. What the railroad would bring down next, out of the mountains, through the smelters, into the banks, was a different order of wealth than the town had ever processed. Denver had built the only door. Now the door swung both ways. Chapter 6: The Golden Fleece. The railroad that Denver had built with its own money and the labor of citizen subscribers did not merely connect the city to the national network. It solved a problem that the mountain mines had been accumulating since 1859. A problem that had nothing to do with finding the gold and everything to do with what happened once you had it. Enter Nathaniel Hill. Hill was a Rhode Island-born chemistry professor who had spent nearly a decade teaching at Brown University before the Colorado ore question drew him west, the way problems of sufficient difficulty draw men trained to solve them. He arrived not as a prospector, but as an investigator, commissioned in 1864 by a group of Boston investors to determine why the ore coming out of the mountain lodes refused to yield its metal to the standard methods. The ore was refractory, a technical term for a stubborn metallurgical fact. Stamp mills could crush it. Panning and amalgamation could work on simple placer deposits. But the sulfide-bearing ore of the Gregory lode and 100 like it locked its gold inside a chemical matrix that no amount of mechanical force would release. The mountains were full of wealth that could not be touched. Hill did not guess at a solution. He went to find one. In 1866, he shipped a consignment of Colorado ore across the Atlantic to Swansea, Wales, where the copper smelting operations had refined complex sulfide ores for generations, where the chimneys had been running long enough that the process was understood, improved, and committed to industrial memory. He spent time there. He learned what there was to learn. He came back. In 1868, he built Colorado's first successful smelter at Black Hawk, in the mountain canyon where the Gregory lode had changed everything 9 years before. The ore that had been accumulating without a buyer now had one. The mines that had been half working around the limitation now had a release. Hill had not discovered new gold. He had made the existing gold finally reachable. He called his operation the Boston and Colorado Smelting Company, and it ran. Then came the railroad. And after it, still more railroad, because it was the rails that made the next step possible. In 1879, Nathaniel Hill moved his smelting works down out of the mountains and into Denver. He chose the site along the South Platte, where the ore trains could deliver directly and the refined bars could ship east without delay. He named the new operation the Argo Smelter, after the ship in the old Greek story, the vessel that sailed in search of the Golden Fleece and brought it back. Not a metaphorical ship, an actual reference. The Argo, Jason's vessel, the craft that turned a quest into a delivery. Hill understood what he was naming. Denver was not where the gold was found. It was where the gold was made real. The silver dimension arrived almost simultaneously, at a scale that dwarfed anything the gold fields had yet produced. Leadville, high in the mountains southwest of Denver, had produced modest gold placers in the early 1860s and gone quiet. In 1877, the carbonate lead deposits there yielded silver in quantities that rewrote the calculus of Colorado mining. The population was 200 in 1877 and 14,820 in 1880. The estimates hold. The silver came out of the ground in quantities that created fortunes measured in millions of dollars in a single season. It was hauled down by mule train until the rails arrived, and then by rail, and in either case, it went to Denver. Denver smelted it. Denver banked it. Denver supplied the camps that produced it. The men who dug the silver lived in the mountains. The men who processed it lived at the foot of the mountains. The arrangement worked exactly the way the provisioning town arrangement had always worked, only now the shovels had been replaced by smelters and the flour sacks by bars of refined metal. The population was 4,759 in 1870. It was 35,629 in 1880. It was 106,713 in 1890. More than 600% in a single decade, almost all of it driven by the railroad and the ore coming down from the peaks. The ore that went into Hill's smelters and came out as wealth that Denver's banks held, and Denver's merchants spent, and Denver's builders turned into stone. This was not the arithmetic of a mining town. It was the arithmetic of a city that had positioned itself at the point where extraction became money, where raw metal crossed the threshold into civilization. What the money started to build in Denver was not modest. The men who had made it in the mountains were done making it in the mountains. They wanted concert halls, hotel lobbies, and marble stairs. The things that money builds when there is enough of it, and the nearest city is close enough to hold them. That city was Denver, and it was ready. Chapter 7. The Queen City. Horace Tabor was not a mining man by nature. He had arrived in Colorado from Vermont in 1859 as part of the Great Pikes Peak wave, swung a pick for years without distinguishing himself, and eventually settled into what he was actually suited for, running a store. He operated his general merchandise business in Leadville, hardware, dry goods, whiskey, on credit when necessary, and when two struggling German prospectors named August Risch and George Hook asked him for supplies in the spring of 1878, he grub-staked them $17 worth of goods in exchange for a one-third share of whatever they found. They found the Little Pittsburgh Load. Within months, it was producing $10,000 a week. Within a year, Tabor had sold his share for $1 million, bought adjacent claims, sold those, and accumulated a fortune that contemporary estimates placed somewhere between $9 and $12 million. He had been a storekeeper. He remained in some essential way a storekeeper. A man who understood that the money passed through the merchant before it passed anywhere else. What Tabor grasped, and what many men who struck it in the mountains did not, was that the camps were temporary and the cities were permanent. The mountain towns were instruments, places designed to extract ore and human energy with maximum efficiency and no particular attachment to either. Denver was something different. Denver was where you went when you had made it, when you were done with the mud and the altitude and the tent towns that froze in November and flooded in June. Tabor bought a mansion in Denver. He bought a bank. And in September of 1881, at the corner of 16th and Curtis Streets in the heart of downtown, he opened the Tabor Grand Opera House, designed by Willoughby Edbrook and Frank Edbrook of Chicago. A 5-story Italian Renaissance building with an exterior of rhyolite stone, an auditorium seating 1,500 people, and a painted drop curtain depicting the ruins of Carthage. The cost was $800,000. Mountain money buying urban permanence, the ruins of Carthage hanging above a stage in a city that had not existed 23 years earlier. Picture 17th Street on a Friday evening in 1892. The Brown Palace Hotel has been open for months. 9 stories of Colorado red granite and Arizona sandstone rising above the intersection of 17th Tremont and Broadway in a triangular form that has no precedent in the city and few in the West. Designed by Frank Edbrook, the same man who had helped build the Opera House 11 years earlier, now giving Denver the tallest building it had ever seen. The atrium inside rises the full height of the structure, tier upon tier of ornamental ironwork balconies looking down on a lobby floor of white onyx, and at night the building is lit from within. Electric light, not gas, the new system that Denver had been converting to across the previous decade, so that the windows glow with a steadiness that gas flames never managed. Walk east from the Brown Palace and the street is alive in the particular way that a prosperous city is alive. on an evening when the opera has just let out. Streetcars moving on their iron rails, the horses of private carriages held by drivers in the cold, women in silk stepping down from carriage doors, the brokers and mine owners and supply merchants and bankers who had built this city from raw transaction moving between the Windsor Hotel, the Tabor Grand, and the Oxford Hotel 3 blocks toward Union Station. The Equitable Building at 17th and Stout is 2 years old, all 9 stories of it, rusticated granite at the base and terracotta above, its tower visible from Cherry Creek on clear days. The Denver Club on 17th Street holds the men who run the smelters and the railroads and the water company. The sounds that carry on a cold October night, the clang of the streetcar bell, horses on brick pavement, the last bars of something from the opera echoing off stone facades, belong to a city that did not exist in 1858 as anything but a speculation and a rumor, a city this certain of itself, this permanent in its stone and iron and electric light built on no deposit of its own. By the early 1890s, the arithmetic of Denver's rise had become one of the more striking facts in American urban history. Colorado had entered the Union in 1876 as the Centennial State. Meanwhile, admitted in the 100th year of the Republic, Denver had been named the state capital. The population that stood at 4,759 in 1870 had reached 35,629 in 1880 and 106,713 in 1890, a rise of more than 600% in 20 years, driven by silver and smelting and rail lines and the whole compounding logic of a city that had made itself the place where mountain wealth went to be processed and spent and kept. It was without much exaggeration the Queen City of the Plains, the unchallenged heart of the Rocky Mountain West, the place where a man who had made something in the mountains came to prove that he had made it. It had a concert hall and marble stairs and gas lines, converting to electric, and the tallest building between Kansas City and San Francisco. It had built all of this from the metals of other men's mountains. The foundation, if you looked at it closely, was narrower than the edifice suggested. The mountains had provided silver for 2 decades. Silver had provided the revenue that built the banks, the opera houses, the hotels, and the rail connections that made Denver what it was. A city of 106,000 people, with a dome coming and a future being written in stone. But a city whose wealth, when you traced it back through the smelters and the exchange floors and the banking houses to its origin, rested on a price set not in Denver or Leadville or any Colorado mountain camp, but in Washington, and on a piece of legislation that some men in Washington had already begun to question. Chapter 8. The Crash. The trouble with Denver's prosperity in those years just past the Brown Palace's opening was that it rested on 2 things. One was the city itself, the railroads, the banks, the smelters, the wholesale houses, the grain markets drawing from the plains. The other was silver. And silver, unlike the railroads or the farms, did not belong to Denver in any real sense. It belonged to Washington. The Sherman Silver Purchase Act of 1890 had bound the two together in a way that the boom years made easy to overlook. Under its terms, the federal government purchased 4.5 million ounces of silver every month, at prices well above what an open market would have sustained on its own. Not a metaphorical subsidy. An actual one, written into law, enforced by Treasury purchase, keeping the mines of Leadville and Aspen and a dozen smaller camps producing at a rate that would have been impossible without it. Colorado's silver economy was, in a precise sense, a creation of Congress. Congress had built it. Congress could unmake it. And in the summer of 1893, Congress did. President Grover Cleveland pushed the repeal through after an 88-day filibuster in the Senate. A parliamentary siege, fought almost entirely by men from silver states who understood exactly what the repeal meant for the people they represented. They lost. The Sherman Act was repealed in late October of that year, and within weeks, the price of silver had collapsed by roughly a third. Not gradually, not in stages, the floor simply dropped. The panic of 1893 was already moving through the national economy when the repeal hit, a financial contraction that tightened credit and shuttered banks from New York to San Francisco. Colorado absorbed both at once. What followed in the mountain camps was swift and total. Leadville's mines closed by the score. Aspen, which had been producing more silver per year than almost any district in the country, went quiet within a season. Banks failed across the state. Not the marginal ones only, but the well-regarded ones. The institutions that had taken in the savings of merchants and miners and freighters who had spent a decade building something. Construction in Denver stopped. Not slowed, stopped. For more than 3 years. Horace Tabor, who had built the Opera House at 16th and Curtis, and whose name had been synonymous with the silver fortune at its peak, lost nearly everything. He died in 1899 essentially without money, the arc of his life closing in almost perfect symmetry with the arc of the industry that had made him. The single industry towns had no such symmetry. They had only the single industry, and it was gone. Denver did not go with them. The reason was not luck, and not geography alone, though geography played its part. The reason was everything the preceding 30 years had quietly accumulated on top of the silver trade while the silver trade occupied the foreground. Denver was a railroad hub, 4 major lines, traffic moving in every direction, freight volumes that had nothing to do with what silver was worth in Washington. It was a banking center, yes, and some of those banks failed, but the banking infrastructure as a whole held because it was not entirely silver-denominated. It was a wholesale depot for a region that still needed to eat and clothe itself and replace broken machinery regardless of the metal price. It was a market for the farms on the plains east and south of the city, farms that were still growing, still sending cattle and grain and wool through Denver's exchange houses. It was all of these at once. The provisioning town had never stopped being a provisioning town, not even at the height of the silver boom. That was the thing the mountain camps could not say. They had been mining towns, completely and only, and when the mine closed, the town had nothing to fall back on. And then, quietly, the last gold rush came. The Cripple Creek Strike in Teller County on the south slope of Pikes Peak, first essayed in 1891 and producing in earnest through the middle years of the decade, was the richest gold deposit ever found in Colorado. Gold, not silver, immune to the Sherman repeal, drawing men and investment back into the mountains at a scale that would have looked familiar to anyone who had watched the Leadville boom 15 years earlier. Cripple Creek's ore came down out of the mountains the same way all the ore had always come down, through Denver's smelters, through Denver's banks, through Denver's rail yards. The town with no gold received it all. The town that had been a fitting-out camp in 1859 was still performing the same function in 1895, at a larger scale, for a richer strike with more infrastructure than it had ever had before. The mountain towns hollowed out. Denver kept climbing. Chapter 9. What Remains? By 1900, Denver had 133,859 people, the mountain towns that had summoned it into existence, the camps and gulches and boom settlements that had drawn 100,000 men across the plains 40 years earlier, were hollowing out. Central City was quieter than it had been in a decade. Leadville was contracting around whatever silver work remained. Cripple Creek, which had roared through the 1890s with the last great gold rush in Colorado, was already past its peak production. The depot town had not merely survived them. It had outgrown them all, one by one, the way a river outgrows the tributaries that fed it. The thesis of Denver is plain now, if it was not before. The supply town outlived every town it supplied. Not one of the camps that had made Denver possible, not Gregory Gulch, not Leadville, not Cripple Creek, was growing in 1900. Denver was growing. It had banks, railroads, smelters, wholesale warehouses, and a diversified commercial base built up over 4 decades of deliberate, unglamorous accumulation. It had no gold of its own and had never needed any. Then, in 1908, the city did something worth pausing on. The dome of the Colorado State Capitol, a neoclassical structure at the corner of East Colfax and Grant, was covered in 200 ounces of pure gold leaf, a formal tribute to the gold rush and the pioneers who had built the state. The gold was donated by the Cripple Creek and Victor Mine, out of Teller County, the same district that had powered the last great boom of the 1890s, the same ground that was going quiet as the donation was made. The men of Cripple Creek gave the gold to Denver. Denver put it on its dome. The town that never had a single ounce of gold in its own soil now wore a crown of it, paid for by a mining district whose own fortune was ending. There is no metaphor here that the facts themselves do not already supply. Walk through the rest of Colorado today and the inventory is brief. Central City and Black Hawk, once called the richest square mile on earth, survive on casino gambling. The mountain that produced a generation of gold fortunes now produces chips and cocktails. Leadville is a small, high-altitude town, the highest incorporated city in the United States, at 10,152 feet, living off its own history and the tourists who drive the mountain roads to look at what was. Cripple Creek is a strip of casinos and tour buses, the sidewalks quiet outside the gaming floors, the mines closed, the headframes standing in the thin air like monuments to a question nobody is still asking. The places that had the gold became museums of themselves. Denver became the capital of a state. The population that stood at 133,859 in 1900 kept climbing through every decade that followed. Through the wars and the Depression and the post-war migrations and the technology booms, until it passed 715,000 people within the city proper and anchored a metropolitan region of nearly 3 million, the 19th largest in the United States. The self-built railroad that John Evans and William Byers funded in 1867, the 106 miles of track laid with no federal cash, made Denver the permanent gateway between the plains and the mountains, a role it seized and never relinquished, the way a river seizes a channel and holds it against every subsequent shift in the terrain. The Brown Palace still takes guests on 17th Street. The Argo smelter is gone, demolished long ago, its name surviving only in the North Denver district that grew up around it. The smelter smoke that once hung over the city on winter mornings is long gone. What remains, a mile above the plains, is the dome. It catches the afternoon light the way only gold catches it, flat and warm and very still, a color that has no business being on a government building in a city built on flour and shovels and railroad bonds. The only gold in Denver is the gold it never had to dig,